Good evening and welcome to another episode of the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith, welcoming you to the National Boardroom, where we are continuing our change in conversation for a better Virgin Islands. This evening with me, I have my learned colleague, Mr. Gerard FARARA QC, and he's going to be sharing with us tonight about constitutional reform and shedding some light and giving us some great information on all this lot of what do we want to say, conversations that we've been hearing going on. So I hope we're able to bring a lot of awareness in terms of the importance of our Constitution and what it means to the development of our country. So Jerry, welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Shaina.
Oh, welcome back.
Welcome back indeed. It's always a pleasure to be here with you on Vigilante Dialogues, and I look forward to the discussion.
Awesome. All right, so recently you gave an address at the opening of the law year last month, and as part of your address you talked about constitutional reform, and I don't think it's by chance that you were the person that led up the last Constitutional Review Committee, the commission that was put in place. So you know, you have a bird's eye view, so to speak, of the whole process and what, you know, everything entails. So let's start with the basics in terms of explaining to all viewers,
yes,
you know, what is a constitution? We hear us talking about constitution, but I think some people probably just think of it as being the laws of the land. But what's special about a constitution?
Well, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So it ranks above all other laws and statutes, whether it be the common law, whether it be statutes enacted by our legislature. And particularly in the context of an independent country, the Constitution, of course, has great significance. But even in an overseas territory like the British Virgin Islands, it is of great importance and significance, because it sets out the legal framework under which the country is to be governed.
Okay.
And we've heard a lot, of course, about the three branches of government, executive, legislative, and the judiciary. And normally a constitution would provide for those three branches, and go on to provide for the manner in which the executive is to function, the manner in which persons are to be elected to the legislative body, and how that is to function in a broad sense. And of course, in relation to the judiciary, the provisions of the Constitution usually provide for the courts and the court system as the third branch of government. You have other legislation that provide for the way in which the judiciary would function.
Okay.
So it is the supreme law of the land. Other laws are normally subject to the Constitution, to the extent that laws are enacted which derogate from provisions in the Constitution. They are said to be unconstitutional.
Yes, we do hear
can
that.
be reviewed by the courts and struck down.
Okay.
Or sections, the wording and language in certain sections that are deemed to offend the Constitution can be, in a sense, excised by the courts in order to make that provision conform with the Constitution. So sometimes the entire law is struck down. Sometimes a section of the Constitution that is challenged successfully is then, in a sense, amended by excising certain words in order for it to become in compliance with the Constitution, and therefore constitutional.
Okay. So basically that's the framework, so to speak, in terms of everything that goes on within the country from a legislative perspective in the governance it takes place. So you mentioned that in the sovereign country, basically they would be the ones to create their constitution. So in our case now, where does our constitution come from?
Well, even in relation to certain sovereign states, particularly those that formerly had been subject to the rule of the United Kingdom, upon going independent, usually what happens is that the independence constitution is given to them by the United Kingdom, by Britain. So oftentimes that first constitution comes from the United Kingdom and not from the territory now becoming a state.
Okay.
For example, many of the islands in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Barbados, Trinidad, etc., etc., their first independent constitution they got from Britain.
Okay.
Many of them still have that constitution, and in some respects, in some of these countries, changes have been made to that constitution.
Okay.
Some more far-reaching than others.
Okay. Okay. So in our case, then, our constitution is basically a piece of legislation in the UK Parliament.
Yes, our constitution is by order in council in the United Kingdom, and is laid before the Parliament of the United Kingdom, and then essentially comes into law in the British Virgin Islands.
Okay. So when did we first get our first piece of legislation? I actually went in preparing for the show, pulled out my term paper from my Virgin Islands history class, which was a year ago. I'm still encouraging everybody to go up and sign up for this class. And, you know, I did it on the political development of the Virgin Islands. So it was very interesting for me to learn that, you know, from as far back as 1773, we had legislature in terms of representatives of the people, and there was a push for some type of court system and some other things because they wanted to bring law and order basically to the country, and that went on for some time. So, but at that point, did we have a constitution, or were we still part of the federation and were being governed by the laws?
Well, going back that far, and I would add that in addition to your paper, in the 2005 Constitution Commissioner's report, in the historical section, we traced the historical development of the Virgin Islands in relation to constitutions or constitutional government of some form. And there's a lot there to talk about, and I suppose that would take up the entire show.
That's a class.
That's a class in itself. But what we see is that at various stages going back that far, we had certain constitutional instruments that were, as it were, given to us, which provided in some way, shape, or form, often to a very limited extent, for some form of constitutional rule and governance within the Virgin Islands. And there are many of these. I think if I am not mistaken, it's certainly somewhere in the vicinity of 15 different constitutions, tracing it back from a historical perspective. And as you know, at a certain point, when we had a legislative government or governance, we lost that for some years, and then in 1950 we got back the legislature, and then we've progressed from 1950. So that is usually the point where we put down the marker from a historical point of view, 1950, when we look at so-called modern development of the British Virgin Islands.
Okay. And that was 1950 was basically the year also where we basically became a separate territory from the Leeward Island Federation and received a constitution.
Yes, yes, yes. And it is noteworthy that a number of our leading local public figures were involved in the process that led to that constitution.
Okay. Yeah, so, I think that's so important because that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the class in terms of understanding now the progression in the development of the country that was basically in tandem with the evolution of the Constitution over the years from that point forward.
Indeed. I mean, this is something which I have sought to underscore because it is underscored again in the historical section of the 2005 Constitutional Commissioner's report. And what we have seen really is that with significant constitutional advancement has which devolve a certain amount of power and authority and over the governance of the country to our elected representatives. That has been, in a sense, paralleled with the strides, the significant strides in our economic development as a country and as a territory. And that is something which we must not lose sight of, because in essence it means that to the extent that our own people, our own elected representatives, have had a greater say in our affairs and our governance, that has led to more significant strides economically and socially and so on in terms of the country. Now, that is not to say that all of it is attributable to what our elected representatives did. Of course, to some extent, Britain still played a role and a part in that, but it is of historical significance.
Yeah, it's very key.
Yeah.
So, and again, I'll make a book recommendation, Virgin Islands Story. I think it's by Dr. Noel Harrigan and Paul Valak. I learned so much from, again, doing the research in the paper and having so much of a greater appreciation of our story.
Indeed. As
the Virgin Islands and how we came to where we are. Because I think a lot of people take for granted that, you know, things just kind of showed up on, you know, the governor felt, well, okay, yes, it's time to put the legislature back in place, or, you know, it's time to devolve the responsibilities that he had to ministers. And from there, you know, the ministers went from 2 to 3, and it kept expanding.
Of course. And when you look at our infrastructural development, the significant strides that we made going back those years, again, that has been tied to greater devolution of authority to our elected representatives. And you mentioned the book by Dr. Harrigan and Dr. Valak. I mean, that what that also demonstrates is that it is important for you to write your own history.
Very.
Because when others are writing it for you, they are looking at the occurrences through a certain lens, different from how your own people will look at those things. And that, I think, has really been underscored by that book by Dr. Valak and Dr. Harrigan.
That's very key. So we're going to take a break at this point. If you just tuned in, yes, this is the Vigilante Dialogues. We are on at Mondays now at 8 p.m. here on Channel 51. And with me, I have my learned colleague, Mr. Gerard FARARA QC. And we've been talking about the Virgin Islands Constitution and its importance to our development. So we're going to take a word now from our sponsors and be right back. Welcome back, and you're tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith. And with me this evening, I have Mr. Gerard FARARA QC. And we have been talking about the Virgin Islands Constitution and the importance of its development to the country. If you just tuned in, yes, we are on now on Mondays at 8 p.m. right here on CBN TV Channel 51, as well as simulcast on CBN Radio FM 90.9. So we just started laying the foundation as far as the history of our Constitution and the importance of our Constitution to any country. So whether you're a sovereign nation or a territory of a sovereign nation, what effect that has on the land, how things are done. So we know that here we have the Westminster, I think it's form of government, is how we refer to it. What exactly is that?
Yes. Well, I suppose the use of the word Westminster comes out of where the halls of power are in London.
That's what I learned.
Right, exactly.
Because of the name of the building.
Exactly.
When the
And of course, the model constitution which we have been using is one which had been crafted by Britain for use in the countries and territories which were part of the British Empire.
Okay.
And so that model and the use of that model in a significant way has continued over the various decades.
So it basically became a global precedent.
Correct,
from
correct.
All the way back
and
then.
So our approach to constitutional advancement has been within the context of the Westminster model, to see how what type of changes can be used, can be brought about in order to have greater devolution of authority and power to elected representatives away from Her Majesty's representative, which is, of course, the governor.
Okay.
Right. So that is why it's referred to in that context. And one of the one of my sort of major points that I have been using in recent times when I've had an opportunity to discuss this issue is that I think we need to take a different look.
Okay.
Our approach to constitutional advancement, in my view, should not be just simply to see, well, Bermuda has certain things that we don't have. And our next round of advancement, we should try to get some of those things, all within the Westminster Model Constitution. I think we need to look at the matter the other way around. We need to look at this the other way around. We need to be looking at it from our perspective as the Virgin Islands or the British Virgin Islands and say, we are a small territory. We are small in terms of land mass. We are small in terms of population. We've had great success in financial services and tourism as the two main pillars of the economy. What ought to be our future relationship with the United Kingdom? How should we be part of, what is the kind of relationship that we should have with the United Kingdom going forward? And I'm not here really in a sense talking about independence, but I'm talking about bearing in mind the peculiarities of the British Virgin Islands, some of which I've mentioned briefly. What would best suit governance of this sort of country in order to ensure that there is greater participation by our elected representatives and also the people of the country in the governance of the country, and what would best suit our own aspirations and plans for further economic development in order to sustain the economy of the Virgin Islands. So whereas in the past the approach has been simply to look at it from the other way around, this is what Britain has given us in terms of our constitution. How can we erode the power of the governor and advance the power of the elected representatives? Instead, we must look at the totality of the country and come up with what I have been describing as a new constitutional construct. And it may very well be one, if it is done properly, that can inform the kind of relationship that other overseas territories should also have with the United Kingdom and may want to adopt. So I think we need to look at it from the other way around, from our perspective. And it may be that the Westminster model would be changed significantly, depending on what we come up with as that new constitutional construct.
Okay, and I think you touched on a lot of key points there, as far as, you know, when we hear a person speaking about independence, and it's really about how do we change the relationship that we have with the UK, because even quote unquote independent countries in the West Indies, you know, they still have the Queen as head of state, but you know, it was a matter of changing the level of responsibilities at that island level to say, well, you know, we're in charge of everything. And what does that everything mean? Because I know I've heard people talking about, you know, well, we don't have the resources to raise an army. But not every independent country has an army.
No.
So there's so many facets in terms of what exactly does the relationship between us and the UK look like. And, you know, from the smallest to the largest. I know one of the other big points that's usually made is about who's in control of the civil service.
Yes.
And, you know, again, whether it's something that remains with the governor because they feel it's going to be in a neutral capacity, so to speak, or is it something that we want to have responsibility for? And what that means to be able to do that.
Exactly. I mean, when you look at the independent countries in the Caribbean that were formerly colonies of the United Kingdom, and you know, who've gotten an independent constitution and so on. There is a view that many of them have not really made a success of that, in the sense that they have not achieved significant economic success, and in some quarters they have not been able to advance the standard of living of their people. And therefore the argument would be, well, why should we consider independence? Another way of looking at this is it is within the context of globalization, because the world has changed massively since those countries that we just spoke about in the Caribbean became independent countries. And globalization has become the order of the day. Various states, independent countries are grouping together for economic reasons, and some of these groupings have gone well beyond just economic reasons. I mean, free movement of people, etc., etc., etc. And the European Union, of course, is an example of that. And we have recently had the whole issue of Brexit, the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. In large measure fueled by a concern which some people have there, that they had surrendered too much of Britain's sovereignty by being part of that union. So globalization and the interaction and between states, independent states in a group, often leads to some degree of surrender of sovereignty.
There has to be a compromise.
There has to be. And so what really does independence mean in the context of the modern world? In my view, we should be looking at crafting a type of constitution, or what I call a new constitutional construct, that is for the 21st century, and that is better suited than the Westminster model for the governance of the territory. Even if that still means continuing in a relationship with the United Kingdom. And that is the way we should be viewing this, and that should be really our approach at the next round of constitutional advancement. As you know, there have been rumblings in certain quarters about constitutional advancement. We've heard it from our own premier, we've had it from the leader of the opposition, and we've had it from other members of the House of Assembly, and we've had it in other quarters on some of the talk shows and so on and so forth. But in my view, our focus should be on coming up with a new constitutional construct, strengthening our democratic institutions, strengthening our oversight, strengthening our accountability, strengthening those things that would ultimately strengthen our democracy and demonstrate our maturity as a territory. And if that means that we continue in some relationship with the United Kingdom, then so be it. But we must craft something that is better for us and not work within the parameters of something that has been around for a very long time and may not have worked
to the best of our interests.
Yes, I mean, may have worked to the best of our interest at a certain point in time, but may not now be working as well as it should in terms of our interests.
And I think that is so key, because it's so much more than, again, like you're saying, because Bermuda is more advanced in terms of within the Westminster system. They do have the two level of house where they have appointed senators,
bicameral,
and they have the lower elected representatives. There are things in the UK Parliament I don't think that they have, as far as like when you have the shadow cabinet in the opposition. So for every minister in government, you actually have a shadow minister. So there's so much education I find that needs to be had, because people, you know, again, we hear a piece here, so to speak, and a piece there, but in terms of understanding the totality of what it is that exists and what exactly it is, as you're saying, we want to have here in saying to ourselves, well, you know, does that mean now having more representatives in government so that we can have more representatives or more ministers, so more representatives in the House, so we have more ministers in government to give, you know, more focused attention to the governance of the country and how these things expand, because the cabinet in Bermuda, as I was reading today, has up to 12 ministers, and I was kind of surprised. But you know, again, they have looked at what their situation is, and that has been basically obviously what they've lobbied for, and have now have in place.
But it seems that Bermuda has had more favored nation status than any of the overseas territories, if I may put it in that way, because they have had their constitution for quite some time. And it certainly represents, in terms of the devolution of authority to elected representatives, the greater advancement of any of the overseas territories. To some extent, we have been trying to catch up with Bermuda. But not everything which Bermuda has would work very well for us. I mean, take a bicameral system, right, where you have two levels in terms of the legislative branch. Is that something that would work well in a small country with a small population like the British Virgin Islands? Is it justified to have that kind of system and the attendant costs that go with you know, supporting and sustaining that kind of system? You mentioned shadow ministers. In an opposition of two, which is what we currently have, you can very well have shadow ministers.
So we definitely need a bigger pool of representatives to be able to
that's
have
another,
that firm.
but that's another question. Do we want a bigger pool of representatives? Some people may argue that we are big enough already in terms of the membership in the House of Assembly, with 13 elected members, 4 at large and 9 in the districts. Some of the issues we should be looking at, and we can touch on those perhaps in the next segment as well, is, you know, we have had that mixed system, at large and district, for some time. I remember when the at large system came into effect, there was a one-man commission report by a professor from the University of the West Indies who taught political science. His name escapes me. I know him very well. I think he's perhaps now a bit of blessed memory. And has that worked well for us? We should be taking a critical look at this. Has that worked well for us? Should it be tweaked? Should it be changed in any significant way? This is dealing with the legislative branch of government. What are the checks and balances, or what are the oversight mechanisms that we have in place in the legislative branch? We should be looking at those issues, because to be frank, I mean, the whole issue of disclosure of information and documents that have been used in decision making or are to be used in decision making of significance in a territory of this nature. The whole question of freedom of information legislation, which has been drafted and has been there for quite some years now, drafted by the Law Reform Commission, of which I was a part when it existed. Is that not something that we need to bring into force? Should we be finding out about documents and information via the disclosure of those documents and information in the United Kingdom? And that's how we are learning about some of those documents. If we want significant constitutional advancement, it behooves us to demonstrate a certain level of maturity in terms of our governance, which includes more openness, more accountability, greater checks and balances, greater oversight. I mean, look at our budgetary process. We should be examining that.
The first thing that came to mind when you started talking about it was, like, for example, the Public Accounts Committee. You know, it's inadequate when we think about the responsibility that they have. And in order to be basically looking over the country's expenditure on a real-time basis, as far as I'm concerned. We shouldn't be looking for a report 2-3 years old, because by then, whatever damage has been done, you know, it's been done.
Yes.
So we really have to be more, I think, in terms of especially the general population, cognizant of when we're asking for more power, that power needs to be balanced and it needs to be checked.
Absolutely.
So freedom of information, you know, that's a must-have.
Indeed.
You know, and to me, when bills are going to the House, these things should be published before, so that again, myself as a citizen can go and say, well, okay, these are what my elected officials are going to vote on, and this is what is going to affect me, because these are laws of the land. This isn't just for a select few, but this is for everybody to be able to again be governed by.
I mean, there are many. You mentioned the Public Accounts Committee, and that's very important. And I think on a previous occasion, when I delivered I believe it was a Frederick Pickering Memorial Lecture, I touched on the Public Accounts Committee. The Public Accounts Committee needs to be strengthened from a constitutional and legislative point of view. I mean, if you look at where we are now, of course, with 2 members in the opposition, it doesn't seem as if the Public Accounts Committee is functioning in the way in which it was intended, in the way in which it should. And even when we look at meetings of the House in committee, at the committee stage, yes, the open meetings are televised, but should the meetings in committee be private? Be private,
No.
or should they be televised?
That's public business.
That is public business that is being discussed there. I mean, there may be issues that are of I would use the word sensitive or security nature, that obviously it may not be prudent for those to be broadcast, so to speak, to the country and to the world at large. But we need greater transparency. What does greater transparency really mean? We need to strengthen our financial oversight legislation and accountability legislation. The Finance Management Act and so on and so forth. That another look should be taken at that. The legislation dealing with commissions of inquiry needs to be modernized and strengthened. We are still working under a very old piece of legislation in a modern world and modern BVI society. That is something that needs to be looked at and completely overhauled. So these are some of the things, and there are many of them. I mean, even
the register of interest. That
the
was
register of
something
interest,
that came to mind, that we're still, I would say, dragging our feet in terms of getting it properly instituted and these things.
Absolutely. I mean, it is operating at a level which really does not support the intended purpose of that piece of legislation. We need to strengthen that because that is part of the accountability. That is part of the oversight. That is part of making public information that is important to the public. So there are a lot of areas that we need to be looking at. We've only touched on a few.
Yeah. And that's the thing where it's a very lengthy and detailed process that would have to go into saying, okay, we're going to reform the Constitution. But what, again, like you're saying, we first have to do that needs analysis to say, well, this is what we think we're going to need for the next 20 years. Indeed. You know, and this is the framework as far as governance that needs to be put into play now, so that it will take us where we want to go in 20 years.
Absolutely.
You know, because oftentimes, and you know, my favorite four-letter word is plan.
Yes.
we are allergic to planning sometimes. So it's like we have to determine, well, listen, to get where we want to go in 20 years, we have to start planning now.
Absolutely.
And put the tools in place, put the framework in place, bring all our systems up to the 2016 or beyond even. Yes. And from there, start to work ourselves in the direction in which we want to go.
Look, you know, size, smallness, and so on can be an advantage. We, I think, have the opportunity, based on the successes we've had in the past, and we touched on the correlation between constitutional advancement and economic, infrastructural, social advancement in the country, right? We have the opportunity as, in a sense, one of, if not the shining light in the Caribbean in terms of success, to craft a model and to develop a country that would be a shining example of governance and how a territory ought to be governed in a proper and mature way. And it starts with the Constitution. It starts with the various laws that we either have that need to be updated or those that we need to put in place. Right. And it starts with creating a new and different approach to how we should be governed based on what our needs are, what are our goals, where we see the country in the next 20 years. Yeah. And these are some of the things that we should be looking at.
Talking about now.
Yes.
Because, and that's interesting, whereas, like, you know, again, some persons are saying, well, we don't need to talk about it now. You know, we're not ready. But in order to get ready, you have to start the conversation. You have to start the conversation. We must not be afraid to start the conversation. And to me, the conversation ought not to be centered on, well, should we go independent or should we not go independent? Because, I mean, there's no discernible groundswell within the country for independence. You know, we've had, as you say, some public statements by various persons to the effect that perhaps we should be looking for various reasons. So, and again, it's something where it might be a matter of policy, it might be a matter of legislation that addresses what needs to be, whatever the concern is, I should say. But to just say, you know, we need to break away from the UK because we want to do what we want to do.
Exactly.
that's not a good enough reason to go independent.
No, absolutely not. And you know, we would have to, even if independence was to be considered something, we would have to look at all that involves or will involve in terms of costs, etc., etc., and whether the country can actually bear that cost going forward. But we are fortunate in the BVI that we have been self-sustaining, self-sufficient for decades. We have not been on granted aid and so on from the United Kingdom, unlike some of the other overseas territories. We have had great successes.
And even independent countries, because when you have to be borrowing money from IMF and World Bank to run your country, that's a problem.
You know, when IMF comes in, you're in dire straits.
Yeah, you're in independence
and they hold your feet to the fire going forward. I mean, they literally are controlling your economic policy and spending.
Well, everything, because I remember watching a documentary on the IMF in Jamaica. And, you know, it was something where I guess it was a former politician was talking about, you know, the agreements were so stringent. You know, they had to make decisions about cutting back on healthcare or education expenditure in order to meet the debt service.
Indeed.
You understand? And so you're really not in a better position now when we're thinking, okay, we get this free money, but it comes at a much greater cost, actually, because now it retards the social development of the country when you start talking about cutting into spending on education and healthcare.
Indeed, and it kind of emasculates your executive and legislative branches, because decision making cannot be made with regard to the spending of that money based on the priorities that you come up with.
Exactly.
You have to justify those priorities to the IMF and get their approval in order to do this. And when you talk about cutting education and other social projects and so on, oftentimes, of course, this does not sound very well for the elected representatives. They're actually putting their political careers on the line, and so on. So, you know, it comes back again to, you know, if you're unable to manage your affairs and you find yourself, or you get yourself into that kind of a position, how independent are you really? And we even have to look at, we can just look across the water here at Puerto Rico. I mean, their whole fiscal and economic policy is now being run out of Washington.
Yeah.
And they can't make any of those kind of decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Not only were the Senate and the House or whatever vote to assist them financially, but they vote to put a whole committee in place to go down
to
there.
basically now govern the country.
To govern the country, at least in relation to economic development and economic policy. So, you know, I mean, they are not an independent country, but they are supposedly a far more wealthy country in some sense.
And they
than
definitely
BVI.
regressed from where they were even just a decade ago.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, you
absolutely.
know, there's so much to this,
Yeah.
and we are running out of time already. Jerry will have to do a part 2. But, you know, one of the things that I would love to see our elected officials take the lead on, if we're going to talk about this, is to, first off, educate our people about the governance of the country so that they understand what's the governor's rule, what's the premier's rule, what does the cabinet do, how does it function, you know, what does the House of Assembly do. You know, it's more than just TV entertainment every couple of weeks. Yeah. You know, they're supposed to be in there doing some very serious business, and how does that affect us? And not just us, but the next generation that's coming. Because when I make a legislation, which is evident now, something that was put into effect from 30 years ago is still in effect now. And I wasn't around. So, you know, the next generation that's going to be affected, we have to think about them and their needs and how, again, we want to see the country develop and move forward and start that conversation and educate, bring awareness. And then from there, you can come and ask me, well, okay, so we're going to reform the Constitution. How does that work? Because I remember moving home in 2003, so I was just in the door before the review started.
Right.
And I remember going to the meetings that were very scantily attended in a lot of instances. And people take for granted that, you know, this affects you in a major way.
Absolutely.
So you cannot, you know, non-participation is not an option, I would say.
Yes, yeah. I mean, you know, talking about education, I mean, even in relation to the Constitutional Review Committee, there were a number of members who, at the end of that exercise, said two things. One, it was an educational experience for them. They learned a lot by virtue of being involved in that exercise. And secondly, they found it to be such a meaningful thing to have been involved in as, let's call them citizens of this country here, to play that kind of a part and role in terms of the future of the country. And yes, I mean, government has a role to play with regard to the education of the populace. But I do also believe that private, groups, I would say even such like for example, the BVI Bar Association and others, could take on something like this, at least to some extent, where they play a role as well in educating the public about the Constitution, about the three branches of government, about the importance and the correlation between the kind of Constitution you have, and not just simply the degree of autonomy that you enjoy, but the development itself of the country, the correlation between the Constitution and the development of the country, and how significant that is. And this is something that perhaps should be going on a fairly ongoing basis, because it is of great importance, and it is not just simply a matter of saying, well, you know, we feel that, well, we have certain limitations in what we want to do, and therefore we need to go independent. That is not the solution. Or even that we need to now be considering independence. We need to determine what is best for us.
And
going
make
forward,
sure what we have is working.
And make sure what we have is working, and strengthen
As
the
a basic.
democratic institution and the democracy that we enjoy. Because ultimately, our elected representatives, those responsible for governance of the country, be it in the executive branch or the legislative branch, must be accountable to the people. And in the final analysis, if the vast majority of persons in the country are not enjoying a good standard of living, they're not able to realize their own goals and aspirations for themselves and for their children, then it means that the system isn't working in some way, shape, or form. Now, it might not just be from a constitutional perspective. It may be in relation to the economy itself, which is so much welded to the global economy and what happens in the global economy that is beyond our control. But, you know, these are important times, and these are significant times in the British Virgin Islands, because we see that financial services has been under attack for quite some time. And we see what has happened over the last 5 or so years in terms of financial services, where generally there is a downward trend in relation to incorporations. We have things like the Panama Papers and other matters such as that that affect the financial services industry, an industry that we created. It wasn't Britain that created this for us. We created it. And an industry where in the current constitution, there was provision made for the delegation of authority to the elected representatives, the ministers, in relation to financial services, from special responsibilities for external affairs that are held by the governor. And that has been handled on what they call entrustments. We've had one in 2005 and one in 2007. The one in 2007 was specific to China and, and Hong Kong and so on. But, you know, that is an area we need to look at as to whether the Constitution should not be changed so that specific responsibilities for the pillars of our economy rest with our elected representatives, where they can do what is necessary in the international arena, within certain parameters, of course, in order to further strengthen and sustain those two pillars of our economy.
Because that is where our economic development basically
of course,
is on.
those are the engines that drive our economy.
See, that's easily part two.
Yeah, definitely.
And it's easily part two, because it you know, just expands on the importance again. The Constitution is the bedrock to the country's development. That's basically what the bottom line is to it. So we're going to definitely continue this change in conversation around our Constitution, and even, you know, looking at the governance of the country and the importance of it also. I want to thank you for being here with us this evening, and definitely we're going to come back and pick up on, you know, looking further into what it is we're talking about when we start to talk about sovereign nationality and independent nation, and, you know, some of the nuances that shouldn't be missed, I should say, you know, in terms of saying, how would you get to that point of even deciding, well, okay, we don't want to go independent, we stop short, but what does that mean? You know, at what point is that?
Exactly.
So
well, thank you very much, Shaina, for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to be here with you.
Thank you. You've been tuned in to the Vigilante Dialogues. I am your host, Shaina Smith, saying tune in on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. when we replay, and on Mondays now at 8 p.m. right here on CBN TV, channel 51. Let us continue our changing conversation for a better Virgin Islands.